Well, today we have Rachel Romer with us, who has created the World of Guild, an amazing company that we are excited to learn more about today. But Rachel, thank you so much for joining here today.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, and just to get started, can you kind of walk us through kind of briefly what your company is all about?
Sure. At Guild, we're focused on unlocking opportunity for the American workforce. And we do that by providing education, skilling, and career mobility for employees, often in the front line all across America, in partnership with their companies and a large community of learning providers, universities, and folks who are inventing the way we're going to train Americans for the future of work.
That's so incredible. What are you doing that's different than maybe a typical educational group has done in the past?
Yeah, it's a great question. First, we design exclusively for the most marginalized employee so that we can serve every employee. And that's been our design thesis from day one, really focused on human-centered technology. And that's powered quite a bit of the variety of innovations that we've unlocked over our almost 8, 9 year journey at this point, little over 8. A few examples might be the traditional old school tuition reimbursement model, the way that companies would pay for their executives to go back to Harvard Business School. As that trickled down to be available, quote unquote, to the frontline workforce, it really wasn't. It was in the policy, but if you're an American and making an average wage, let's assume, $20 an hour, 40,000 a year, you don't have $5,000 to front to go back to school while waiting for your company to reimburse you at the end of the year. That's a huge financial risk. And we know the average American has $400 in their emergency savings account, not $4,000. And that emergency isn't necessarily skilling. There are a lot of other problems they need to solve for. So we were the first company that invented a payments platform that could connect employers and learning providers and educators and universities all across the US so that no employee had to pay up front, which enabled a path to debt-free education for millions. But that's just the start. Since then, we've been building out a variety of skilling and career mobility pathways and solutions and coaching models. And in our mind, hopefully the fabric that gives folks a chance to move into the middle class and to thrive there.
So powerful. I love how you're supporting that demographic of people wanting to elevate themselves. One of the things that I think Guild has done well to kind of promote you a little bit is the fact that you've grown so much, right? From my understanding, you've got relationships with Chipotle, with Walmart. You've raised quite a lot of money, have a solid validation or valuation, which is incredible. But it doesn't start there. There's a lot of people who have ideas, and a lot of those ideas tend to fail. I want to go back, way back, to when you started. What was the start of this idea? What was the gem that got you started?
You know, in some ways, I feel really fortunate because the problem we want to solve of upskilling the frontline workforce to make them more resilient for the future of work and then to give them a path to thrive in the middle class has never changed. That was it. And Guild came out of research work that I led with a team of folks across Stanford School of Education and the business school. What has changed is the how we've addressed that work. Some of the ideas we were putting on the whiteboard back in 2014, 2015 now feel like ancient history. And I think that's been a key to our success is we've been really stubborn about the problem we're solving and really flexible about the variety of solutions and approaches that we're willing to try to get at this systemic challenge.
What were some of those problems, or so I guess solutions that you guys came up with early on that you had to pivot away from?
Well, I mean, we were prototyping and hacking everything. This was never intended to scale, but one of the ways we tested all of our theses about what the workforce needed was we stood up career boot camp sessions in strip malls up and down parts of California where we were living at the time, and literally would put them on Craigslist and advertise, yeah, we weren't trying to make money. It was more like, hey, here's this group of folks who have some background in understanding of career progression and skills and helping you advance in your career, come to this workshop. And we did, I think a dozen of those. And like that data was a big part of the pitch we used to raise our seed round. So it never ways intended to be the scalable product, but it was a way to hack our way towards the insights that we really needed before we built technology and scaled this thing.
Well, that's brilliant. It's just understanding the market so that you can pitch the investors, at least at that seed round,
Yeah.
with more real data. That's really smart. What was it like trying to get those initial investors?
I feel privileged in that we raised from folks that were in or adjacent to the Stanford community. I think it's gotten better in 9 years, but I think 9 years ago and still today, capital is too constrained in regional areas on the coasts. And so we were really benefited by the fact that we started Guild in that region and off Stanford's campus. And so we were able to raise from folks who were willing to take a bet on us, even though we didn't have full proof of concept. We hadn't built companies before. I think venture capital is working to democratize itself. We're seeing that here in Denver, where we moved the company after a year. I continue to see that more in the middle of America. But I think if we're really going to if we want technology to solve the most important problems in the world, not just the highest revenue generating problems in the world, we need venture capital to be in every part of the US and ideally globally versus, concentrated on the coasts.
I like that. What was it like? Did you created a pitch deck? Did you go knock on doors? Did you already have relationships? How did you find the exact right people to talk to?
Yeah, we had a pitch deck. And we started, actually, one of my professors at the Stanford D School, where I really learned human-centered design, was himself a venture capitalist. And I went to him because we were unsure if we were starting a business. We knew we had all this great research that we had accumulated. We knew there were a lot of insights, and we knew there was a model. But I actually thought, and if you had connected with me in early 2015, I would have told you we were starting a nonprofit. And that's the model I was more familiar with. I had grown up in the public sector and had seen a lot of nonprofit operating more so than actual corporate or small business. And we thought this was a problem that could be solved effectively in the nonprofit sector. But what I learned very quickly as I basically A/B tested, I went and met with philanthropists and met with early stage venture capitalists. And what I learned was that the venture capital model was going to do two things for us. One, it was going to uncap our ambition to scale. And two, it was going to allow us to hire technologists and really make this thing fly, which is obviously related to number one in scale. And the main way I learned that was by asking each potential funder, what does success look like for you 1 year, 2 year, 3 year from now? And the philanthropists mostly thought linearly. And they talked about the grants application and how you'd raise money. And, maybe you're serving 100 students this year and 200 the next. And the venture capitalists asked me, well, how fast do you think you can grow? How fast do you think you can scale this thing? And I look back on had we funded this philanthropically, I think we would have followed that linear progression. And instead, in 2018, Guild was serving 9,000 students. And so I feel really grateful that we took that path. And it's really helped me form a bit of a nuanced perspective on compassionate capitalism and how capital markets can actually drive good. I was a skeptic of that.
How did you get past being a skeptic because you were focused on that nonprofit route?
Well, so I believe that government can play a really important role in solving systemic issues. And I believe the nonprofit sector has done a fair amount of that as well. But I think that's gotten harder in the US of late. I think a lot about the role that the government played in the 40s and 50s, building the backbone of the middle class. We did a really great job as a country doing that post World War II. We really built an iconic middle class. Now, it wasn't accessible to everyone. It discriminated against women and people of color, but it was a leap forward in anything we'd done before in terms of building that stability of a true middle class that I think really supports a lot of great institutions like democracy. I don't think the government today is set up to as effectively build. They might
Mm.
fund. I think the government could do more to fund middle class institutions. But with the rate of technology and the speed of technology, I think private institutions can play a really important role building the infrastructure and systems. You look at how 401k has substantially outpaced tools like pensions or social security in terms of creating retirement. I think that's a good example. And I think Guild is following a similar path to, say, a vanguard of solving a cultural and systemic issue, one that may include government funding, but probably includes private sector technology and innovation.
Yeah, I love that. I actually couldn't agree with you more. I think the private sector, when done right, can have a very large positive impact. So you're at the stage where you're pitching investors. Was it a struggle? Did you get a lot of no's, a lot of people pushing back, or did you actually was it pretty easy to get the funding you needed?
You know, we've had plenty of struggles at Guild, but
Yeah.
I will admit that fundraising has not been our core
Interesting.
challenge. I think, I mean, I'll emphasize it again. I think you get a huge leg up when you're raising off Stanford's campus. And I think the fact that we also had an alternative, I think I believe in BATNAs from the negotiating
Yeah.
framework, but I also just believe that when you have a competing alternative, it's compelling. And so it was helpful that in those early VC conversations, it was, we were either going to raise or we had offers to raise 5x as much from philanthropy. And I'll, I'll tell you, my mom thought that was crazy because my mom said, you just took on, student debt and a whole bunch of time to go to Stanford Business School. And you're telling me you're going to choose 2 million from these folks versus 10 million from the philanthropic group. Like, honey, 10 is bigger than 2. What did you learn at this business school? And it's just a good reminder of the complexities of all of it. But I chuckle about it. But no, I think because we had a strong alternative, it gave us a lot of strength. And I
Mm.
feel grateful for that because I have so many friends who've struggled to fundraise and who've struggled especially in that get started zone.
Yeah. So you have capital, you've got a mission, but you still have to build the company. What were those early days in building the company like?
Yeah, so the hard part, building the company, right? The early days were, I mean, they were high, they were low. I always think of it, there's very little that is steady state, boring, status quo in those early days. The wins are euphoric. I'll never forget. I mean, we've now raised a lot of capital, well over 600 million, but watching the first 2 million go into the bank account, don't have a moment of any other fundraise that beats that. But more importantly, like the early milestones, signing our first partners, our first graduate who we went and celebrated with a flash mob at his Chipotle store. And back to, the power of capitalism, creating wealth for our employees. I remember when one of our coaches, a great guy named Jonathan, came to me and said, hey, before Guild, I worked in the community colleges as an advisor. You all helped increase my salary by, I don't remember, it's probably 15, 20%. And I get to put a down payment on a home for the first time. Can you be a reference on the mortgage? And that's a powerful moment. And made me realize, like, not only are we creating better middle-class jobs for the learners we serve, but we're creating them for our own employees. And that's a big responsibility. And I remember when we then, probably a year later, weren't quite sure if the company was going to make it. I remember thinking of his mortgage and the responsibility I felt for that.
Tell me more about that. What was going on that you felt the company may not make it?
Oh yeah, I mean, we had every trial and tribulation, but in the fall of 17, we just hadn't gotten the flywheel humming yet. We were fighting it in all three. We're a 3-sided marketplace, and we had our energy pulled in all 3 directions, trying to get all 3 elements humming. And I feel lucky to have a lot of founder friends who also run marketplaces. And it's like the pit of despair, because once the flywheel flies, it's fantastic. But when you're in that early days and you're trying to drum up supply, demand, for us, it's three-sided with the employers, the learning providers, and the employees who have to be interested in what we're offering and excited and enrolling. Nothing was clicking. And we had kind of a come to Jesus moment, and we reset our goals. We narrowed them in, but we said, like, we got to hit this goal or else we don't know what comes next. And luckily we did, but it was a real struggle.
What was the goal that you set?
We wanted to enroll our first couple hundred learners. So we set, or for next couple hundred, not our first, we'd already been humming for a bit there, but we set a goal for a specific month, and we called it like the March to 400. And we literally had a stand up every single day where we would touch base on what we'd accomplished the day before, the whole company. I mean, it was that level of just drumbeat after drumbeat to really figure out, are we hitting the micro milestones that might add up to the mid-sized milestones that might make us believe this thing can scale. We knew what we were doing was important. We knew we were creating impact, but we didn't know if it could truly scale.
How many employees did you have at that time?
I think about 60.
60?
Yeah.
So every day, I suppose the biggest challenge here is simply to get alignment at a deep level so that the micro actions that people are taking are actually helping toward that long-term goal.
Right. Yeah, because it's. I always think about startup growth as a curly kind of a. It's like a roller coaster with loop-de-loops headed upwards. Everybody who zooms out, if you squint, it looks just up and to the right. But there's actually lots of steps backwards as you curl backwards to pop back up and curl backwards to pop back up. And we were certainly in that because we'd already tasted some success. We had a strong late 2016, a strong early 2017, but that success has to compound, and you have to keep building all three parts of the flywheel at the same rate, especially in a marketplace.
Yeah. So you got this big goal. Things aren't quite working in this moment. How do you keep morale high and people engaged, knowing that it's kind of a tough spot?
It's an interesting question because I think I'd do it differently today. Leadership came a little easier to me, but management was a hard-earned task for me. I was a young founder. I hadn't had a lot of management experience at some, but nowhere near the scale. And I hadn't learned to lead leaders of other leaders, right? I hadn't had multiple layers and spans of control, et cetera. And so I think I did all I knew how to do then, but I think it probably tilted one more ounce command and control than I would want, maybe more than an ounce. Back then, because I had come, out of business school, I had all these frameworks and mindsets and tips and tricks, and I'd read all the books. But I kind of jokingly tell the team I felt like I put on a girl boss blazer every day back then and tried to show up the way I thought the female leader was supposed to. And a year later, in part, as I got pregnant and really entered a chapter of motherhood that made me feel more authentic and more myself, but also just as the company grew and I came more into myself as in just both my own confidence and my years of experience, I kind of took that blazer off and wore sweaters, cardigans. That's more my vibe. So I think I was trying to muscle through with some girl boss model back then that now really doesn't fit me.
It's fantastic. What did you learn? What was there a key moment? Was there something that happened that you're like, oh, okay, I've got the wrong approach here?
There's lots of moments of that. And I wish it was a one moment where you take the blazer off. I mean, I think it probably took me 2 years to unwind all that. I was just telling you about 17, 18. But the most iconic moment was probably around the feedback I got in late 2019, where folks were starting to see behavior change from me and liking a lot of it, but feeling like it was inconsistent. Hey, we see this, more empathetic, more vulnerable, feminine side to your leadership. And then sometimes we see this other persona, this other archetype, and it doesn't quite square. Who's Rachel the leader? And by the way, we prefer the former, not the latter. And I got a dose of feedback like that in different forms and fashions through a 360. And so I wrote a letter to all of our directors and above at that time and kind of said like, hey, I realized I'd been trying to do all the changing behind the scenes. And I realized, okay, that's not working. I need to actually tell people how I'm trying to change and what I'm trying to change. And for me, it was more peeling an onion. I wasn't trying to become someone else. I was actually trying to be more myself and shed some of the layers. And so I wrote everybody a letter that at the end of the year about what I wanted to change and who I wanted to be. And that was probably the most poignant moment. But I really do think it was a 2-3 year, and the process isn't over, right? Like I think as leaders, we're always developing, one, to be who our company needs us to be, because that changes. My job description changes a lot. And two, to just be more and more authentic and true versions of ourselves.
Mm. That's so good. I think people respond really positively when you're that authentic and raw and open to people.
Yeah.
I guess I should ask, how did people receive the letter?
Really positively. I realized there was, people in the tech and founder world talk about building in public, about like building your product in public. I now think of it a bit like leading in public, like actually showing people where you're trying to change, showing the ways you're developing or trying to develop or learning or trying to grow. You get a bunch of allies. You get a bunch of people who can be supporters and hold you accountable, right? But it's really powerful.
It really is. I've seen the same thing. When you're open and honest and transparent with your own issues, and people are willing to give you a degree of grace in those issues and willing to help you through it, way better than being defensive or trying to hide it. Because when you do that, they just become cynical.
Yeah, we talk a lot about grace at Guild, actually. That's one of our favorite words. Yeah, I think giving more grace to one another is a really powerful ingredient at work.
Mm. What that's really awesome. Let's dive into that a little bit. What kind of culture are you building within your company right now?
Yeah, so that's been a lot of the fun work as I've become a more authentic leader. The culture has become even more important to me, and I think I've been able, I hope, to be more influential in shaping it. We have 4 core values at Guild that really drive everything we do. We started with 9, which is too many. We wrote them in a business school class, but they were resilient, and we've trimmed them down to these 4, but the concepts sit within the 4. And then we have 10 core competencies that we actually use to measure those values at every stage of Guild. We use them in our interviewing, screening candidates. We use it in our performance. And we're even embedding it deeper into our growth and development at Guild right now. So the values for us are learner's mindset, really embodying that, being an owner. I guess I can share a little bit about them, but like the part that is really iconic for us is that learner's mindset, and it's a combo of both a learning culture, but growth mindset in the way that Angela Duckworth frames it, of really keeping your brain soft and nimble and practicing grace with yourself and others to be a constant learner and to seek what is right versus being right, and to really focus on teamwork and collaboration and letting the right idea emerge versus needing to have the idea yourself, and concepts like that I think are really powerful and sometimes contrary to classic company culture.
Mm. What so you're at a point now, several years ago, you're still growing, you're still building the company. What are the struggles? What are the things you're tackling around this 2019, 2020 as COVID starts to hit?
Yeah, let's see. 19 was hyper growth and scale of both my family and the company. I had twins in 2018, and so I was figuring out how to be a new mom and finding my way and leading this newly scaled company. We went from, I think that about, I think we were probably 80 employees at the beginning of 18, and then we were 400 by 2020, start of 2020. So had, many X to the business and 4X the team. And then COVID. As a multi-sided marketplace, COVID hit us in different ways in different places. We work largely with nonprofit universities and learning providers that are online. So they were actually experiencing tremendous scale during COVID as people stopped attending classic community colleges and found their schools. Our employers were in all types of upheaval, but it really depended on the industry they were in. Looked very different for our friends in hospitality that were gutted, our friends in retail that suddenly were working 24/7, our employees in financial services who were trying to figure out how to do a call center job that had been in person for decades from their house, and a whole myriad of issues. And then for our own employees, we had been 400 folks in Denver, but we happened to complete an acquisition the first week of March of a San Francisco-based company. And we used that plus the uncertainty of those first few weeks of COVID to say, all right, we're going to be a remote company for the future period of whatever this looks like. And we actually unleashed remote hiring too. So it was a lot of change.
How did COVID impact your business?
In the short term, it was a really hard time to connect with HR teams. I mean, they were especially in the front lines because we serve, I left out hospitals, but we serve healthcare, call center populations, retail populations, restaurants, and hospitality workers. So the front line that became sort of iconic, and I feel like a lot of Americans learned that term, frontline workforce, in 2020. I mean, those have always been our people. And they were kind of carrying America on its back during COVID in all those arenas. And so HR leaders were, focused on keeping their employees safe, healthy, alive. They weren't taking phone calls to think about upskilling. So we had a real drought for a bit there where it felt unethical almost to bother those HR leaders who were in survival mode. That came back just fine, but it was a really quiet and scary period. And then our members and our learners actually went back to school at a higher rate, which is something you see in recessionary environments. Vulnerable Americans and same with folks in other countries go back to school at a higher rate when the economy is unstable because they seek to get more stability in their own individual career. So we saw actually an uptick.
That's really interesting. When one of the things that we're looking at this season of our podcast is this notion of tenacity. I want to dive in. You mentioned something kind of interesting there, which is there was a period that was really scary with the HR professionals not being able to connect with them. Open that up a little bit. Help us understand what was scary in that moment. How did you guys overcome those concerns in that time?
Yeah. I mean, it was literally one of the three sides of the marketplace who we needed to outreach and sign and have grow wouldn't return our phone calls and we actually realized we just shouldn't call at all. We need to just take our foot off the gas. So that's just, I can't imagine another era where you really make that choice as a business. It really felt like wartime in that way. So you had to have a lot of faith that we could spin it back up. Two, we actually completely stopped hiring. We'd only hired a few business development and employer partnerships folks at that time because we were still quite small. And the founding team had actually myself included, done a lot of the early work with our first kind of 10 to 15 customers. But we kept a halt on hiring as well. So we didn't hire the team. We had just two folks kind of hanging on. Yeah, it felt existential. And in some ways, COVID also reminded you, at the end of the day, this is just work. And there are bigger and more important things. And I do think that is one of the hacks to tenacity, is being obsessed with the problem, finding the energy to keep after it day after day, but actually not letting it, getting away from a world where it feels like life and death. I think there's a myth that if it's all the founder cares about or the team cares about, the company will be more successful. I'm actually now of the alternate opinion, which is keeping some distance, remembering that there are things like family and health and, the stability of the communities we live in and the nation we live in and the world we live in. Actually having that perspective, I think can actually fuel tenacity rather than take away from it.
Well, yeah, if you if you spread yourself so thin on that one issue you're trying to solve, you're not going to be as strong of an individual as you could be in that moment if you don't have some semblance of being filled up in some other way, if it's family,
Yes.
religion, whatever that is for you. So
Yeah.
yeah, I really couldn't agree more.
I think venture capital's got to make an adjustment on their persona mapping there, because I think there's a tendency to love the, 20 something, often single, often male, for whom the idea and the company is their only purpose and their only focus. I don't think that yields iconic companies
Mhm.
as much as they might think.
That poses an interesting question. What is it like for you working with your investors, your venture capitalists?
I'm lucky in that I got to pick really good ones. So when I speak about the venture capital lore, I'm certainly holding out the ones I've had the great, and there are a lot of great venture capitalists, to be clear. But I think it has been a myopic community in some ways, in that it's really designed around pattern matching. And so when there's one breakout company, people attribute success to all kinds of factors that may or may not be correlative, and so there's these personas of, the wealthy single white man who builds a thing. And it might just be that he picked a great market. It might not be all those other dynamics. And so I've worked hard to both build a diverse board, but more importantly, build a group of investors and board members who value diversity and value the problem we're trying to solve well above any of the myths or mythologies of how to build a great startup.
Did they get nervous during tough times, or are they a group that you can rely on during those tough times to help you through it?
Oh, the board is incredibly supportive during the
Mm.
toughest times, actually. I made plenty of mistakes in 2020, and I also just really struggled. I was a young, mom with two. My kids were barely two. I had, them at home, all the challenges of trying to navigate how to even just like get through the days and the weekends and the nights in COVID, when we all weren't leaving our houses and we didn't have all of our regular support systems and outlets. And there was a point where I really was uncertain whether I had it in me. I had really hit a point of burnout, and was dealing with uh, just classic depression that came in that period. And I went to the board and said, I'm not sure I've got it. And instead of, feeding that fear, they said, no, you do. But what resources and support do you need? And so changed up, added a different exec coach that I hadn't worked with historically to add some new perspectives. The board really kind of wrapped their arms around me and told me they believed in me. It meant a lot.
Do you think if you hadn't had that board, it would have been tough to make it through that period of your life?
Yeah, I
Professionally?
think if I had been a bootstrapped founder at that moment and not had a board, and I have plenty of friends who operate that way, um, I probably would have handed over the keys. I would have probably just hired somebody and given them the keys.
What do what do the boards say that, or what do they do that really help encourage you during that moment?
Yeah, I mean, in the very momentary, like I can remember a phone call with my independent board member Leanne, where she just literally created a space to hold my emotions, because leading can be so uniquely lonely. It doesn't look like it, but as you know, it can be so lonely. And so she just created a really sacred space to hold those emotions and make it safe for me to share those emotions. And then the coaching and support. Ken Chenault, who's on my board, actually introduced me to his exec coach, who historically had only worked with Fortune 500 CEOs, and which I was not. I did not look like the rest of his coachees, but Ken asked him to work with me and gave me a new set of models and tools. And I love coaching, and I love having a diversity of coaches and advisors. And in that moment, they're, they really saw that I needed some help.
What did the coach bring to you that was so powerful?
Oh gosh. Whole variety of things. I believe deeply in a regular coaching practice. I've had a coach and a weekly coaching session every week since I started Guild. It's actually the first investment I made when starting the company. I asked the VCs if they would be comfortable with me spending, I think at the time it was like $12,000 a year, which felt like a big investment. I was, I was just figuring out what to pay myself. And I think we were going to pay ourselves like, 70,000 a year. So I was going to spend, you know, close to a sixth of the value of our salaries on this coach. And because I'd had one of the investors as a professor prior, he, I think, really understood the value, and guild coaching's kind of core what we do. We have
Yeah.
a team of hundreds of coaches. And so I wanted to, that that is embedded in both me and the way I want to build a company. So the new coach, that Ken's coach, gave me much broader perspective, right? Helped me understand how CEOs around the country of much bigger companies were evaluating the challenges of COVID, navigating their own personal issues. It's always helpful when a coach can give you abstracted of like, hey, a lot of folks like you are really big extroverts. How much is this work from home crushing your soul? How much do you miss the office? How much do you miss the teamwork and the camaraderie, and like tapping into those kinds of things and making it feel less like you're alone when you learn that all the other CEOs he talked to that day were saying the same thing. So that sort of perspective, and then also a lot of tools and frameworks for addressing these uniquely challenging moments that felt like they were coming up kind of left and right during that early COVID era.
Do you find that there's a big variation in quality of coaches? Is it important to
Huge.
find the right coach?
I think it's a crazy J curve. I think, unfortunately, coach is a free title, and anyone can hang a shingle on their door that says they're coach. There is no JD, there is no MD that sits behind it. I don't know that there should be, but it's just a nature of the role. And so I find that there are, unfortunately, lots and lots and lots of low quality coaches, but the best who are on that top of that J curve are outstanding. And I've had the pleasure of working with, 3 or 4 of them intimately, and then others through retreats and offsites and those kinds of things. But yeah, I think people should be really careful about who they welcome into a coaching relationship, because it really is a two-way relationship.
How do you find the right coach?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to ask people who I respect and who are facing similar challenges or have similar desires for improvement as me. The coach I work with today, I met through YPO, but also she coached one of the founders I admire most. And so that was an important reference. But I think you have to date a coach the same way you have to really spend time getting to know someone you're going to work with in your work life and hire. You have to spend a ton of time with before you make a decision. Same with like a therapist. I really believe you can't just match, set, make. And so spent time. I think it's great to spend time, attending retreats or offsites or sessions that coaches have before you enter an engagement of a lot of one-on-one coaching.
So as you look back on your career, what have been sort of your biggest highlights, the things you're most proud of achieving?
I hope it's not trite, because it's literally in our mission statement, but career mobility is the thing that gets me up every morning. So I get a story a day of somebody who's advanced in their career because of the services and products and solution we've provided them. That's like, nothing feels better than that. And then seeing within our own company, I am so deeply proud of folks who have grown with us, who took the early bet on the company or took a bet at any stage in their career to come and join this idea that had all the reasons to fail, and then built it with us. Like I really, I feel like you get founders at many stages of the business, not just the early. And so I think of a lot of those employees as fellow founders with me. And when they're promoted or when they grow or even when they leave, we now have a couple Guild alum who are building their own companies, and I feel privileged to invest and advise them. And it's just, to me, that's magic. Nothing makes me feel better.
That's awesome. If you, looking back on the other side of things, what are some of the biggest challenges you faced, and how did you claw out of them?
Yeah, I mean, that summer 2020 that we were talking about is probably the biggest challenge I've faced. But I think more broadly, the thematic challenges of the journey I've been on are pretty related to when the job changes. And I think that's the funny thing. I've had the same title for 9 years. It's a title I gave myself, which I didn't, which I had plenty of imposter syndrome about to begin with. And then the job changes nearly every year, really every quarter. And so I actually literally now have a practice of rewriting the job description to say, here's what I'm doing this quarter, because I find it really helps my team and me to get clear of like, here's what CEO means right now. But the challenges that have been, most striking have just been when I've been, caught off guard by the speed of change of that job description and when the job changes. So, I think 2020 in particular required new cultural competencies that I hadn't focused on as much. Had to learn how to lead a 500 person company, a remote company, and a company during a time of racial reckoning. And a lot of our work serves diverse communities and serves folks who have been marginalized in the workforce or in their careers, women, people of color, LGBTQ employees, you name it. And so we had to get a hell of a lot better at that too in summer 2020. And we were holding the mirror up to see like, are we as good at this as we, hope to be? And the answer was no. So all of that culture work, that was hard. That was really hard.
What made that challenging?
I think the compounding effect. I was really used to having, 100, then 200, then 300, then 400, but still capped at 400 employees in an office every day. And I had like my ear to the ground. Didn't mean I had it right, but I was in the hallways and I picked up things and I felt like I had my pulse on the company. And suddenly it didn't have pulse on, it felt impossible. Now I know how to do it, but we didn't know. And so I felt our employees' sense of accountability to get it right, to figure out how to be a successful remote working culture, to ingest this 100 employees we had just acquired from another business, to re-examine our DE&I approach, like all these elements. And yet I suddenly didn't feel like I had a pulse, an accurate pulse on how to do all that and how to address it. So, it took, I feel like we threw the kitchen sink at it, but we slowly figured it out.
What techniques are you using today to keep that pulse on your organization?
I mean, one, just blunt and constant surveying. Like, I think a lot of companies wait until they're bigger to take employee surveys and employee feedback honestly. And I think it's also vulnerable for founders in the early days to do that. You're afraid of getting criticized. So we overhauled that strategy and really tripled down on it completely. We also overhauled our DE&I strategy. It had been, I think, good, probably great compared to other companies, and not good enough for the mission that we sign up for at Guild and the work we do specifically related to DE&I. We needed to be best in class. And so we really needed to improve. And then also, bringing in experts. We did a lot of the early stuff based on intuition and, just trying to do our best with, it's sort of like parenting, right? You're like, I haven't done this before, but I've got a lot of instincts and I'm just going to do my very best. And we were at the size and scale, but also had enough wake up calls that it was like, it's time to bring in some folks who've seen this, who've been there, done that, and can help us bring best practices and marry those with our instincts.
One thing I love about you, just talking with you, is your sense of vulnerability and honesty about who you are. One thing you mentioned was that imposter syndrome. We've had success, and I know a lot of other business leaders who are, that $1 billion kind of scale. And people look at that and they think these are these untouchable kind of people. But when you get to know them, they're just real human people. Like, walk me through, help me understand, what was that imposter syndrome like for you?
One, let's start with like the reality of it, because I actually think this part gets understated. Like, I really believe business involves a lot of luck. And I also believe luck compounds. And I believe I've had a really lucky life. I was born on third base in many ways. I didn't have college debt myself. That let me go to graduate school when I was young, that let me start a company when I was young, that let me afford childcare to start my family when I wanted to, when I was young. I mean, I've had so much fortune that compounds on itself. And I think one, like, being really aware of that is actually quite important, but not letting that then become your imposter syndrome of like, therefore I haven't earned anything, is the fine balance. And I think we've tilted far more to, there's a lot of leader figures who think they pulled every bootstrap up by themselves, and they forget, what compounding effects brought them to where the situation and circumstances through which they were born. And I think you need to, one, acknowledge that and acknowledge privilege and support and luck. And then also find the right way to honor your superpowers. And I think that's kind of the cocktail that both prevents raging imposter syndrome, but also hopefully prevents hubris. Because I think we have problems with both in the business community.
Yeah, I love your perspective there and being honest with the head start you've had on life. If you're to give maybe tips or tricks or recommendations to those who maybe didn't have that head start, maybe recommendations on how they can achieve what you've achieved?
Sure. I mean, we talk about this at Guild all the time. We really believe that you need to package serendipity. Too much of today, the American dream relies on these moments of serendipity, like the right mentor, the right boss, the right person who opens that door, that, that one conversation in the hallway that led to this, that one airplane ride where you swap business card. Like those magical moments we kind of treat as iconic in the American fabric. I actually think we got to get away from that and say, like, how do you build a whole ecosystem of those serendipitous moments to give people more shots? Because the reality is, like, there's a lot more quote unquote serendipity in wealthy communities. There's a lot more serendipity on elite campuses. There's a lot more serendipity once you've entered elite firms, elite businesses. And the thing I always remember on that is I was in a community college student lounge where I was a coach early in my career. And me and this other coach, I was telling them, we were swapping a story about how we had both seen people we knew recently in the airport in Spokane, Washington, and Washington, D.C. We're like, God, the world is so small. The world is so small. And this 18-year-old who I really appreciated, and he worked in a jail as a janitor and then went to school in his free time. He interrupted me and he goes, Miss, world's not that small for the rest of us. I've only been to the airport once. I didn't see anybody I knew. World's not that small for the rest of us. And so it's just a good reminder that we got to change the systems and structures that let people build successful companies. Like I don't really like the things that made it easy for me to do it. Like you shouldn't have to be on Stanford's campus to launch a company. So I think we have to figure out how to democratize a lot of the building blocks of entrepreneurship, which is how it has been at other chapters. Again, always in pockets and structures and never as demographically as diverse, of course, as we would have liked. There have been other eras where it was a bit more democratized. And I'd like to see us focus on democratizing entrepreneurship again and doing it in a way that is demographically ubiquitous for women and people of color and folks from all zip codes in the United States.
That's fantastic. That's a world I want to live in.
Yeah, right?
Yeah. When you look back, you've obviously had an incredible education, but now living the life of being an entrepreneur for so many years, is there something that you wish your younger self would have learned early on that would have helped you?
I still go back and forth with questions like that. On one level, I'm grateful for like every hard lesson because it's so hard to know what butterfly effect would have taken me in a different direction had I not learned all those hard things. On the other side, like, yes, a million lessons. I think the lesson that would have caused me a lot less angst had I learned it earlier was maybe a more empathetic, vulnerable, feminine style of leadership. I spent a lot of time on elite college campuses, as we've discussed, and it took many years after that and many years of failing in what I thought was the model to like pick up a Brene Brown book and start reconstructing my view of leadership that felt much more true to what my heart and my soul sort of felt authentic with. So life sure would have been easier had I found that earlier. But again, I'm sure that the path I took blessed me in many other ways that I can't always identify or put my finger on.
Yeah, there's something to be said there, the lesson of hard knocks and learning it. Because you can book learn something, but unless you've actually lived it, it's hard to really apply it in your own life.
Yep.
So I love that. Is there anything that you want to share with our audience? Anything you have going on that you want to share with them?
Good question. I mean, we always got fun things going on in Guild. I guess
Yeah.
the most exciting work we're doing right now is really around career mobility. We've launched our career accelerator and a number of new products and services. So we're really excited to do that. And I think more broadly, because of the focus of the conversation, you asked, what do I wish people who haven't had as much of a head start in life knew? I really believe this. I think we have the fortunate Guild of working with 50 plus companies that are the place to move into the middle class for folks who are looking to get the jump start in their career. And so the message I'm always spreading, whether it's, with a Lyft driver who's telling me he wants to get a salary job or this or that, is like, there are these companies, whether it's Chipotle or JP Morgan or all the great hospital systems we work with, like UC Health. Those are the companies you should go work for if you're looking to jumpstart your career. And it's different than entrepreneurship, which we've been talking about today. But they're places who on day one will give you a great shot at the middle class and they'll pay for your education. And so that's probably the other message that I'm always trying to reinforce, because we're in this era of everybody moaning, as they should, about the student debt crisis and the 1.7 trillion that's been accumulated. And I meet young people all the time who feel paralyzed. Like, do I go to college and take the bet on this massive debt and put my family and me under that? Or do I go take an hourly job and settle? And the answer is you don't have to do that. There is a third way. And that's the message I feel really passionately about sharing.
That's so good. Such a struggle for people living those two options, but the fact that you've offered this additional third route to actually bridge that gap is amazing. I love it.
Thanks.
Rachel, thank you so much for spending time with us and giving us your insights of what your experience has been like. I've so much enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you, Mike. I really appreciate the opportunity.